for impact. Today we're going to be talking about finding where to intervene in complex systems, which I think is like teams have been. I think we've got like four teams working on sort of like different issues and stuff, which is pretty interesting. One team I think that Hung joined has been working in Spanish, so now they have to like translate everything that they've done into English, which is, it tells you about like the diversity, I guess, of our community as well. Like when you've got enough of a group to just do your thing in Spanish, which is really awesome. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about finding where to intervene in complex systems. Hopefully by now you would have chosen what the problem that you want to tackle is. You would have sort of started to map your system in terms of what are the forces that you see in the system. And hopefully as well, by the end of this week, you will start to sort of socialize your map and sort of test the story that or the narrative that you're creating with different people, in the community that you're focused on. So, I think team 4, if you're focused on homelessness, you might want to reach back out to the people that you spoke to last course and sort of talk to them and say, this is what we're thinking about the system. This is the story that we're sort of coming up with. How does that sound? And sometimes people give you really good feedback in terms of like, that really resonates with me. And other times they'll say, actually, that kind of makes sense, but it's not how I see the world. I see it as this. And you sort of want to incorporate all their feedback into your system map. So hopefully that's this week. And next week, really, once you've sort of, socialized your map, that's really when you're going to start to find where to intervene in the complex system. Any questions about any of that or what happened last week? So as a reminder, last week we sort of started with system mapping in terms of exploring different topics like mental health and remote work and food waste, and sort of starting to map them in terms of what affects what and what are the different inhibitors and forces that we're seeing through our system. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time, as usual. So I want to start with a story, and I've mentioned it a few times, but yeah, I sort of I had a tiny role to play in the Egyptian Revolution, and that, like, from a systems perspective, that's really interesting, right? And it's interesting in a few ways, but does anyone know why or how the Egyptian Revolution started? Like, what was the thing that started it all? All right, take that as a no. So how it all started was, there was obviously a lot of poverty and injustice in Egypt. And what happened is this one guy, I forgot what his name was, but you can look it up. Basically, he was arguing with like public officials about the price of bread, right? He was trying to run this restaurant and the price of bread was increasing and he couldn't really afford it and he was really struggling. And what ended up happening was he actually went in front of the parliament and he set himself on fire. And obviously, really tragic. The guy, thankfully, like, they managed to put the fire out pretty quickly, but that's sort of what kicked everything off, right? When people heard about, how desperate that person was in terms of like, he felt that he couldn't, support his family, he couldn't run his restaurant, he couldn't do much. The prices were increasing and he just couldn't afford life. That's sort of when people almost like came to the realization that, hold up, like, we have to do something about this. And I think that was like on the 17th of January, 2011. And on the 25th of January, so 8 days later, that's when all the protests started. And obviously, you might know about, that the protests went for a very long time until the first president left, and then they elected a second president that people weren't happy with, and then they got rid of him, and then and then they got a third president elected. And that's sort of like the idea of finding where to intervene in a complex system. Like, if you do it and you do it well, and it's not like doing it well is not so much a function of like, how much work you spend on it, but it's actually a function of like learning in it and adapting and talking to people in your community. But if you do it well, that's sort of the change that you can create. Obviously, we're not going to go and put ourselves on fire. But the idea is that, such a massive revolution, especially when you think about it in terms of the Arab Spring, started all just from one action, right? And, the ball is sort of like snowballed from there. Any reflections on that idea so far? Welcome, Jeff and Sachin, by the way. Sachin, I like that you changed your I into small I. It was a big I in the middle of your name before for like a couple of weeks.
Oh, I didn't realize it.
That's all right. You're still Sachin. Yeah. Any reflections on that, Kyle?
Yeah. So the first thing that came to mind was, so I'm curious where you're going with where to intervene with the system, but I'm also kind of curious about when to intervene with the system. When is it primed? Because if this had happened 3 or 6 months beforehand, and this wasn't a sentiment that was widely felt across the entire system, it kind of would have been one crazy guy doing something that was an anomaly.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have had the windfall effect that it had.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say that, this guy like went to his house when he was facing this problem, started mapping a system, and I was like, oh, I reckon if I do it, on the Wednesday, this is all going to start to snowball and we're going to create the Egyptian revolution. It almost happened sort of like by accident. And I think it's a good point in terms of, we're going to talk about like identifying in the system where there's pent up energy, right? Where people really want to create change, but something is blocking the change from happening. And you sort of like see that in a lot of movements, right? Especially things like the civil rights movement, things like Greta Thunberg, right? In terms of like, it didn't take much for people to sort of like resonate with her and sort of say, yeah, we sort of subscribe to that. Let's start protesting for the climate. And I think it's a really good point in terms of, like identifying when is the right time. And I don't think that's like, there's like a scientific approach to identifying the right time to intervene in the system. It's almost like what works best for now, given the situation that we're in now. Again, conscious that we're not going to be like, okay, we're going to wait for the right moment, assuming that we'll like even know when the right moment is to intervene, right? It's like, what's the best that we can do right now? Yeah. Love your thoughts, Carl, about like when versus where as well. Not versus, but when as well as where.
I think this was...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I also think that it was more spontaneous than anything else. And obviously it was connected with the Arab Spring that was blowing right through the Arab world, which started in Tunisia. And it was pretty much an emotional reaction to someone who was very innocent, who self-immolated, I think, in front of a government building. And I think the reaction, whatever followed next, was not something which I believe. I don't know if there was a toolkit which was being shared across everyone. But I think the reaction for this particular revolution was very spontaneous. I think a lot of people connected with what the other person did, and when he burned himself in front of the government building, I think that created a lot of anger amongst it was a pent up anger that came out in the form of a revolution, I think. And I also know that especially during the Egyptian revolution, the Arab Spring, they used Twitter a lot to spread the message, and that was when the true power of social media came out. That was when the people started realizing that social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., could be used to create such revolutions. And then it really spread like wildfire. I remember there was one such thing. They had this particular Arab Spring in Bahrain or somewhere. And then it was crushed by the emir of that particular, I think it was Bahrain. Yemen also saw the Arab Spring. Syria, we all know what happened in Syria. Syria was it's in complete mess right now.
Yeah, that's very true. And I don't think there was like necessarily a systems thinking toolkit, that people were like, this is how we're doing it. But I think there was a lot of sort of like thoughts about what worked historically in terms of activism, right? How do you get people sort of on board with your message? And how do you sort of like resonate with people in terms of the story that we're telling? So I think they definitely, the people that organized the protests and stuff definitely did a lot of right things, whether they did it because they knew that was the right thing or whether they did it and sort of like learned and adapted on time. Over time, it's like for us, it's the same message, right? It's like when you engage with a system and you want to create a change, you need to learn and adapt on time. It's not going to be a flash in the pan. It's not going to be, most likely it's not going to be, I try something and it works and oh my God, it worked. It's like, no, you have to sort of like, keep trying and keep going at it.
Also, I think it should be more proactive rather than reactive. I think in this case, it was more reactive. I think when you change the system proactively, you also make it more inclusive.
Yeah.
The results are more acceptable across the board.
Yeah.
Versus when you do something like this reactively, then you don't know what decisions you are taking, whether they're going to work for you or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of like, you're absolutely right? Because like you're almost in the heat of things. So it's very difficult to like understand the true impacts of what you're doing. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Let's go to the next one. So what we're going to learn today is we're going to focus on a few things. How can we identify intervention points? How can we make a difference with small experiments? And then how might we create hypotheses or leverage hypotheses to inspire action. And when we talk about intervention points, I'll use a couple of terms. One is intervention and one is leverage points. And it's sort of the same idea, and we'll talk about it. Cool. All right, so to kick off, what we're going to do is we're going to split into teams for 5 to 10 minutes. And we want to look through the maps that we did last week, to help you sort of like jog your memory about what's happening, and then share a story of what you believe is happening in the system, right? So sort of remember what's happened, what you were mapping, whether you're focused on mental health or food waste or remote work. Sort of try to remember what was happening and what your team was talking about, and sort of start to create a narrative together to sort of say, this is what we believe is happening in the system. Any questions before we split into groups?
Yeah, I wonder if you'd do me the favor of putting the link to the maps in the chat.
Of course.
Because I haven't recorded that.
That's all right.
Thanks.
No worries. And go to the yellow section as well. Oh, Kyle's already in there. Nice guy. Okay, so I'm just creating the 2 breakout rooms and I'll post the link in the chat as well. So if you don't have it.
Thank you.
No worries. So link should be in the chat. The rooms should be open. I'll join one of the rooms, but I'll stay silent so you can work without my contribution. Hello. Welcome back.
Hello.
We want to hear from each group, I guess, about what their story of what they believe is happening in the system. So I think we've got mental health and remote work.
Sorry. So, Abram, I would like to respond to Jeff's point
Mhm.
on the story that we were discussing on the stigmatization of people with mental health.
Mhm.
And me and Farzad, we presented an argument as to what happens with people with mental health issues. Now, I had a very nuanced approach towards mental health stigmatization in terms of the external factors, which is people having to face discrimination
Mhm.
within the society with strangers,
Mhm.
versus a nuanced approach that meant that stigmatization also happens with people who know you, the co-workers, your family, your friends, etc.
Mhm.
And to Jeff's point, he thought that those features or those elements have not been captured
Yeah.
on the systems map. So, Jeff, these elements, if they are not captured, we have to include them somewhere
Yeah.
in the systems map. We did not do it. I understand. Maybe we did not go that deep into the systems map, although I did put abuse, family, friends, but maybe that was not enough. But then we have to continuously keep upgrading the systems map.
Yeah.
So you are right. We may not have captured that element, but we have to do it.
Yeah. Oh, Jeff, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think the map should tell the story, basically.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yep.
you can elaborate on that, but there was
Yep.
two stories. One related to stigmatization, and the other related to, I think, Farzad, if I understood your argument correctly, that, you know, stress and abuse are out there, and people can suffer from some event, and, you know, there's a spectrum of mental health and mental illness, and that anybody can be subject to this. And I think that's another story about mental health, which looks at it doesn't just happen to people who have something wrong with them, but it can happen to anybody. And I think there's two separate stories there, and both of them, there's further work to be done to capture those stories on a systems map, I think.
Yeah, agreed, Jeff, about your reflections in terms of like the system map needs to tell a story. And I think that's sort of the point of the exercise, right? Is like we're constantly sort of like iterating the system map to tell the story that we want, and sort of refining our story based on what we're creating in the system map. So it's
Yeah. I mean, this is, and I didn't participate in that group last week, so I don't know what happened, but I suspect that this is just, you know, the sort of thinking that gets triggered by revisiting it and thinking about it with fresh eyes. And so then there's the opportunity to capture these nuances, these different arguments more obviously through the system map.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Sounds good. Agreed. All right. Do we want to hear from the other group about remote work? Who wants to go?
I can get.
Sorry, you're hung.
Me and Kyle just about to speak. So, yeah, you want to give it a shot, or I should give it a shot?
Yeah, go for it. I talk all the time. After you.
I see. So our topic was about remote work and viewing our map. We identify that the boundary between our remote working and our home is getting smaller in a sense. And then once we identify that in essence, we kind of discuss about a further question on who is responsible to keep the boundary of your home life and your work life, separate. Is it the individual? Is it the employee? Or is it the state? Then we also discussed about, Kyle also gave an example about about how he has to show evidence that he's actually working, not idling around, and then discuss about behavior modification. We discuss about behavior modification, then discuss about not ethical scenario on behavior modifications and surveillance in a sense.
Awesome. Kyle,
Yeah,
did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so it was interesting. We were talking about as you're letting more and more of your that boundary erode away, and you're allowing more of your employer in. How much does trust become a factor, and how important does that play? And that's the behavior modification there. That trust itself is going to cause different reactions in the space. And so that's kind of what we wanted to explore a little bit further, is how do we respond to letting our employer into our homes?
Wow, that's neat. That actually resonates with me because I do quite a bit of work, and I think I'm sort of like in a lucky position, I think, because I'm in a high trust organization, right? There's very minimal like tracking other than those emails they send to like catch you if you're not paying attention to like which emails are phishing. But yeah, but I can imagine sort of like in other organizations that I've worked with, when it's low trust, it's like you constantly feel like you're getting watched. Like, I know someone who's like, no, I need to make sure my dot is green, otherwise people think I'm not working. And it's like,
Yes.
that's just like a waste of time. Just like close the whole application and tell people I'm trying to focus. But realistically, that not helpful, Abram. Okay, cool, awesome. Let's go to leverage points. So how we want to think about leverage points are basically these points in the system that if you manage to activate them, or if you manage to create that specific feedback loop, or break a feedback loop, or strengthen or weaken something, that will activate parts of the system, right? And that will help the system change itself, right? So you don't want it to be this sort of like constant sort of like dog that you have to feed, right? You almost want it to be like this thing where it's almost like a fire, right? You start the fire with like small sticks, and all you have to do is just add wood on top, and all of a sudden the fire sort of catches. And it creates sort of like the impact through that. And how you want to sort of think about the impact of your leverage point, if you finally decide like this is what we think we're going to use, is you want to actually map it through the system, right? You want to map, like, if we change this feedback loop into this something else, what do we think is going to happen, right? As sort of like your leverage hypothesis, which we're going to talk about. So coming back to like our story of the Egyptian revolution, right? All it needed was like this, I say that like cautiously when I say all it needed, but this action of a man burning himself out of desperation, right? And a phone and social media, sort of like Bhushan was saying, in order for people to sort of like have the drive and sort of be willing and actually take action. Right. And that's sort of like, on the right there, that's the impact it created, right? Obviously, the system sort of like, the different parts of the system contributed lots of different things in order to, organize, a massive group of people to protest. But how it started was this like leverage point, of this man burning himself, someone capturing it, and then, the story getting shared around, and people using social media to self-organize. When we're talking about where are our opportunities for leverage, and this is just something that, this is one of the maps that people created last week. What we want to think about is a few different types of leverage points. Okay. And I think we spoke about one where it's like there's this pent up energy, and we're going to come back to that. But the first one is like, what's frozen, right? And those might be like, or what parts of the system are actually frozen and they're unlikely to change. Right. So sort of like funding arrangements, or, things like that historically get done. And, for the next 100 years, they're not going to change. Right. And why you want to sort of highlight that is, well, for two things. I think different people see something as frozen, and other people see the exact same thing as, pent up energy. And then you have a discussion about why that is. And maybe it results in you changing or updating your system map. But as well, if you come to the conclusion as a team that this thing is frozen, it's unlikely to change, then that's probably not the best place to put your efforts, right? when it comes to the next course, for example, of prototyping and creating change. The other one is I thought the photo was pretty cute in terms of like a dog in a kennel, you know, like when you open the door and the dog just goes crazy. It's like blocked energy, right? Or it's pent up energy. It's like this idea of the Egyptian revolution where a lot of people thought there was unfairness. A lot of people wanted to do something about it, but it just took this action to unlock that change. So people want change, but something is unblocking. So that's blocked energy. Bright spots are basically you want to highlight, like you want to understand where do we see people doing things differently, like, right? Like say, for example, if you're looking at the system, at homelessness, for example, or food waste, if you're looking at food waste, you might be like, okay, where do we see restaurants like doing really well in terms of food waste? You know, they have barely any food waste. And why is that? Right. And you sort of want to explore like, how are organizations, or how is the system operating differently or achieving different outcomes in that specific area? And then the last one there is a sort of like the mixed bag leverage point, right? Or the mixed bag, you know, loop in the system, which is sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And we see this a lot with news, right? Like sometimes news are like, you know, drive people to go crazy, and sometimes news sort of motivate change and inspire action. So it's sort of like this loop or this dynamic in the system where sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It really depends on what's happening around it.
Hey,
yeah.
Abram, can you go back one slide and explain that one? I didn't quite catch that one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. So let's say, for example, if we're talking about the education system, right? Say in Australia or in Canberra where I'm staying, say like, you know, people, you know, say 20% of people graduate. I think I was listening to a story about Hawaii where 20% of people that go into college graduate, right? So they go into university, graduate. If you see, for example, a uni, right, that's like achieving 50% of people that enter it and graduate, really, that's like the bright spot, right? You want to sort of examine why that is. What do they do differently in that university to help them achieve different outcomes? So that's what we really mean by bright spot. It's like, you know, they're doing something different and it's resulting in better outcomes. And you want to
someone in the ecosystem who's performing well and what's working for them.
Yeah.
Oh, outliers is another way to say it.
Outliers. Yeah, very good.
It's I look at it as something like a competitor analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Like you enter a market with a certain expectation, you're not doing well as you expected yourself to do. And then you now want to study your competitor and see where they are achieving bigger goals. Yeah, so it's
typical consultant.
I'm laughing because Kyle had shared a video in which Dave Snowden said that the book Lean Startup, basically he captured all the successful companies and showed this is what they do. But when him and Dave Snowden and his team has done the same research in IBM Canada, the successful and the unsuccessful teams did the same thing. It was just that the market is so big. Someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. It was, that's why I was laughing. It's interesting that you may do the best things in the right way, but still there might be natural elements again.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting sort of like bringing it back to design and stuff, and, you know, strategic planning and stuff, Bishan. And it's, you know, that you see parallels in all these methods, right? You see like, there's definitely like the idea of iteration, right? It's not just, you know, unique to systems thinking. It's like in design, it's in human-centered design, it's in UX, it's in UI, it's in service design. It's like anything with design, it's got the idea of iteration. Anything that's like not waterfall, basically.
Right.
Cool. Any other questions about those few different sort of ideas about different, you know, different almost points in the system or dynamics in the system? Floodgate in a sense. Yeah, that's really good, Hung, in terms of like, you know, all you have to do is just like unlock the gate and all of a sudden you've got a flood. Yeah, cool. Cool. Awesome. Sounds good. The other thing that we want to think about it in terms of like identifying leverage points is sort of, you want to sort of like understand which part of the system, if we change, right, it can have ripple effects, right? Like sometimes, you know, it will just be dead water. You'll drop the pebble and it just nothing will happen, right? And then sometimes it'll be really like, you will look at a system map and you'll be like, this area is really ripe for change. Like people are ready, right? Or the system is like really looking for it. And if you just create that, the first ripple, you know, sort of like Greta again, in terms of like the strike for school, no school Fridays, whatever it's called. It's like she just did it, and then lots of people picked it up. You know, youth all around the world were started to protest. The other thing, the other sort of like reminder to take is that you really want to take a participatory approach to this, right? You don't want it to be like, you know, who's the expert on education? Let's get them in, and they will tell us where it is. It's almost like that expert bias of like, you know, sometimes, and I think Kyle has spoken about this before, in terms of like, when I feel like an expert in a specific area, all I want to talk about is that specific area, right? Because that's where I feel comfortable, right? So if like if you bring like if we're talking about, say, food waste, or if let's say we're talking about homelessness, and you bring an economist in, what you want to avoid is them just talking about economy, right? Like you want them to look at the system map as a whole and sort of, you know, take that, like, let's have a conversation about what we think is happening here. Sure, focus on economy a little bit, but don't make that your focal point. But instead, what we want to do is sort of like have a conversation as a team and with the people that we're engaging about this system map, about why we see this point as frozen versus, or this dynamic as frozen versus as blocked energy versus as, you know, a bright spot, right? You want to have that conversation, and that actually helps you in two ways. The first way is it helps you understand the system more, and the second way is it helps you refine your system map and your story about what's happening in the system. Any questions? Any questions? Okay, now it's going to be your turn. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to go for 10 or 15 minutes again. What we want to do is look through your map and then pick sort of different colors or whatever you want. I think we've all done it plenty of times. Pick different colors to sort of highlight different parts of the map, which are frozen or blocked or bright spots or mixed bag. And I'll paste those slides in there for you, so you know like how to refer to them, and have that conversation as a team, right? Kyle, why do you think this part of frozen? I was actually thinking it's a bright spot, you know, or why is this a mixed bag? I was actually thinking it's a blocked energy. So have that conversation as a team. Don't just, don't just do it in silence. Any questions before we go into breakout rooms again? Cool, awesome. I'm really excited to see what you come up with. Cool. So remember, we're going to go for 10 to 15 minutes. All right, so the rooms should be open. Dawn, which room were you in? I'll assign you to that one. Who are you with? Were you with Kyle?
I was with Kyle. I was in room 2.
Okay. Awesome.
I should be good now. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. No worries.
Thank you.
Finn, you're all good? Hello. How was that? I attended team one's remote work team, and the discussion was pretty lively. But how did you find that exercise in terms of looking at the system map and identifying, what are the types of like points that you're seeing?
I feel like we were a little slow to get started, but once we got the ball rolling, it was like we're all filling in things, and we're all on the same page almost immediately. It was sloppy to get started, but
Mhm.
And then once
We
we
went
got it
from
figured out,
frozen
it
to
was
blocked
insightful.
energy to bright spots.
Yeah,
As
Oh,
a
really?
team,
That's good.
as a team, we were frozen. Then we won a dark spot, and then we were bright spots.
Well, we'll see, depending on what Dan says, whether you're an outlier or not. Maybe they did a good job. Dan.
Yeah, I enjoyed, like, without getting into what we talked about, I enjoyed the map as a communication tool. Like, it was really, I found it facilitated getting into discussions in a certain lens really quickly, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, it's really interesting, sort of like you start with mapping this thing, and when you're starting, you're like really confused, but also like mapping it actually gives you a bit of clarity, right? Because you can say, do we have sort of like what Jeff was saying, that story is great, but you don't actually have it in the map. So let's add it. Yeah, awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, guys. So types of sort of like, or sort of like types of actions that you can do with different leverage points that you identify. So you can strengthen a positive dynamic, right? Say there's like a lot of funding going at this specific area, and that's creating a lot of impact. It's like, okay, well, how can we scale that, right? If there's like a bright spot that you want to sort of like replicate, okay, well, the question is like, how do you create that but at scale? You can also weaken a negative dynamic, right? So you can choose sort of like a dynamic that you don't see is very helpful, and then you can see, hold up, what if we actually like reduce the resources that we're putting into those efforts. You can also do things like create and break a feedback loop, right? So if you see like two things that aren't connected, but you think, actually, what if we connect those two things and create sort of like a positive feedback loop through them? And that's sort of like, it's like, I think of like co-design, right, in government as like that approach, right? Like typically government is separated from the community. So it's like, how do you create that feedback loop between, government's policies and how the community is feeling, right? And sometimes people use co-design to do something like that. But you can also do the opposite, which is like break a feedback loop that you don't think is helpful. You can speed up and slow down a feedback loop. Like there might be like a feedback loop, but you're like, yeah, but the feedback isn't like quick enough, right? There's almost like time delays in these dynamics that you're like, okay, I think we should, what we could do is speed them up or slow them down. So now that you've sort of like identified a few different like spots of that you could leverage, what you want to do is you want to sort of like take some time to think about what's your leverage hypothesis. And you don't just sort of pick one. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You actually want to pick a few. And out of those, you'll sort of like filter down again to sort of say, okay, well, which ones align with what we're doing. So how you want to think about your leverage hypothesis in terms of like writing or communicating it, it's basically, how will your action filter through the system? Right. So that's the first part. So what's the thing that we're doing, and how will that filter through the system? How will that, once it does filter through the system, how will that create or change feedback loops and create ripple effects? So you want to sort of like not just look at the immediate impacts of your action, but also how that will ripple across the system. And then how is that going to impact what it is that you want out of the system, right? So if you're trying to reduce homelessness, how will that, that leverage point reduce homelessness? If you're trying to reduce food waste, how will that leverage point ultimately reduce food waste? And it's really interesting because sometimes when you actually play it forward, you don't consider, like, you think about leverage point, but you're not thinking about how that's actually, in a narrative sort of way, how that will sort of translate into impact. But what's really interesting is sort of like when you step through it, you start to identify almost like these different ways that you can use this activity that you're doing in the system to create impact, right? So it's not just like, we will do this activity A, and then all it will do is it will just like, you know, create this one ripple and that will reduce homelessness. It's like, actually, we can then talk about it and then we can inspire other teams to, you know, to use systems thinking to create change. And then we can sort of like use that as like a good news story and then, you know, push the government to invest more into reducing homelessness. You know what I mean? So it's almost like you want to think broadly about what's that leverage point and how can you use it across the system. Once you've sort of identified, you know, a few different leverage hypotheses, what you want to do is you want to talk about as a team, right? What's the potential of this leverage hypothesis and how well does it align with our strengths and weaknesses, right? Like what's unique about us as a team or what are we particularly good at? And then what opportunities are we identifying that align with what we're doing? So for example, you know, if you're a team focused on homelessness and you have like a lot of connections with grassroots organizations, that might be like something that you're like, you know, which of these hypotheses really align with our ability to connect with grassroots organizations versus, you know, like a team who's really good at like getting senior stakeholders like government officials on board, right? Like what you do will be slightly different. And, you know, on the left side, a bit more on that, what you want to do is like look at the potential for impact, right? So how big could this impact be, but also how plausible is it, right? Like how realistic is it that we will have that impact? So yeah, that's it for today. Just a reminder that what you want to do is you want to create a hypothesis, test it and adapt, right? Your first few hypotheses aren't going to be, you know, you're going to almost like build your understanding of the system through these hypotheses and by taking action. It's not just like, okay, we've built the system map, you know, we've done the system story, great, now we can take action and we don't come back to it. It's like, no, actually over time what you do is it's like almost like what Simon Sinek refers to as an infinite game. You're sort of constantly learning and adapting, right? There's no like, you know, we've solved homelessness globally or we've solved food waste. So a reminder to, you know, constantly learn and adapt as, you know, one of the best ways that you can operate in a system and create change. Awesome. Any questions about this week?
Now, this frozen, blocked, and bright spots mixed bag, this is all very new, so this is giving me a lot to think about. I'm working on potentiality in systems, and tomorrow I'm actually doing a big 2-hour training on that. And so I've been working on this for a couple months, and that this is potentiality is around the idea that people within the system are the biggest change, your biggest or your most impactful agents of change. And so now I'm thinking about this in those terms, in terms of people as being influential or able to be influenced versus sort of grounded in institution, or elements within a system that are not people, that are immobile versus brittle, fragile components.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that connects well with something like the idea of community-driven design in terms of helping communities create change that they want to see rather than just like coming in and doing it for them, or, you know, creating the change that they don't want to see. They're like, no, we don't want to change this part of our society or culture. And I think Dan probably has a lot of sort of experience of that, like almost like community-driven design. Awesome. Oh, go Dan.
No, yeah, definitely. And like I was saying before, it's such I like this way of visualizing it. It's so, yeah, if you were to do it with a community, it would get everything up there and be able to facilitate those conversations. And yeah, maybe you would hit a point where, you would disagree on what should be changed, but it's a nice way to visualize it and talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of like we're thinking about doing like a facilitation course in terms of like actually facilitating conversations, but then also sort of like visualizing people's conversations. And I think that's one skill that's really helpful in terms of like when people are talking and they're sort of like talking, right? And it might be building on each other, but then they leave the room and it's like, what can we refer to come back to that conversation? It's really useful to have like something visual, like a system map, or, you know, there's a bunch of other tools, right? To be like, this is what we were talking about last week. Let's pick it up and sort of build on it, as opposed to, you know, let's revisit the same conversations over and over and over again, or let's, you know, have a conversation, but we're not really getting to the depth of it. We're sort of just like surface level. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think those sort of like projects then where you're saying like, it would be amazing to sort of like bring people from the community and say, let's sort of like talk about this issue, right? And visualize it and map it together. That's like super rewarding, right? Because you're not just like ultimately creating change you want to see, but you're giving people the tools that they need to create the change that they want to see, which is awesome, right? Like I think, and that's sort of like the premise behind Design for Impact, right? It's like giving you the tools to you know, look what's happening in Canada and say, you know, I want to tackle this issue, or I want to focus, or I want to engage this community.
Yeah, I think the idea is steering into praxis, which is, if you guys are familiar with the concept of praxis, it's the ability to make decisions and act in uncertainty. And the best example of this, if you guys are familiar with Chopped, the Food Network TV show where they bring the basket of all the ingredients and they tell them to make something good. It's like, it's the combination of two types of thinking. Basically experience through failure and experimentation versus just book knowledge and understanding the science and the discipline behind things. And so kind of to set the stage for potentiality in a system, it's enabling that sort of self-discovery. And then the idea is that with self-discovery, you get heightened awareness at decision points. With heightened awareness at decision points, you get new action, and that new action leads to change in the system. And it's kind of unpredictable. It's totally chaotic. Well, it's not true chaos, but it's like, it's hands off at that point. You've lost control, but you've enabled the entire system to sort of evolve to its next potential state.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that sort of like, Sachin, I remember the first time you came, you were saying like, oh, I was looking at like, what was it? You were looking at like performance arts or something on Eventbrite, and you came across our event and you're like, you know, I'm really interested in that. And it like really lines up. And I'm like, wow, that's like a really interesting way of looking at it. Do you remember what I'm talking about on that?
Yeah. I don't recollect how I landed on it, and I did, and I was like, this is interesting because I remember in 2012 or 13, I had enrolled for a course, something of this sort, and I just couldn't continue it due to work obligations, whatever. And I was like, well, there it is.
Yeah, the word is serendipity, and that's what you want to sort of set the stage for.
Yeah.
True.
I have a point to make, and which is to kind of reinforce what we are learning over the past few weeks. I think we should, there are two ways of doing it. One is we take up a fresh project, and the likelihood is that we rope in you as well, Abram, and we chart the entire systems thinking course with you. That's one way of looking at it. Or the other way of doing it is that we get one of you guys, I'm looking at Kyle and Dan and possibly other people as well that I have not known so well yet, that we bring in a case study and then we sort of trash it out over a few sessions to kind of see what we've learned in terms of frozen and the mixed bag and the other elements that we wanted to capture. I seriously think that we should do it the third way, and of course that is a moonshot, is that we group people into countries and continents. So we have people from Canada, US, and we take up a project from our neighborhoods or our countries, and then we tackle that using the systems thinking principles that we've learned over the few weeks.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea around sort of like almost coming together as a community. Like, it's amazing to have diverse communities, but it's almost like the difficulty of applying systems thinking is like the issues look different in different countries, right? Like homelessness looks different in Australia than it does in Canada. So I really like the idea of, yeah, feel free to start channels on Slack of like country channels to talk about specific issues. And even like next course, what we could do is, yeah, sort of put people in terms, not just in terms of time zones, but in terms of countries that they, you know, want to work on the issues regarding. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Awesome. So next